It brings me great pleasure to welcome you to the third round of the Vienna IV. I'm sure everyone feels wonderfully refreshed this morning. The motion from the House is something about Vienna and Ottakring. There's no question about standing order. It brings me great pleasure to call upon the Prime Minister to defend the motion. Stand in his name. Here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, we think that this debate takes place in a framework where, to a certain extent, our policy has already happened. And we're perfectly willing to provide a mechanism for making it happen even more. But to some extent, this is a case about managing reality more than it is about creating an artificial reality. We've only really got two key reasons why we think this is great, but we think they're sufficient enough for us to carry them around. The first is to say that the provision of state services is much more effective when people from ethnic communities in which they have, not necessarily mainstream access to the language of the dominant population is much more effective, a variety of reasons why that's the case. And second, why this will benefit integration in the long run in terms of being able to make these people better able to break into the mainstream, focusing primarily upon the psychology of people both within those immigrant populations and with those of the domestic populations themselves. So first, insofar as we want to have a mechanism, we're having a fairly light touch one. We say that we're willing to do this by both public service provision, by saying we are focusing on these areas and advertising this to these people and thereby encouraging them to move, encouraging new immigrants to locate in these areas, because we say these are areas where we've specially designed for you, where there's a lot of people from your ethnic background who are living there already, and we think it would be better for you. In the event this is insufficient, we are happy enough to use light amounts of incentivization to encourage people living in there to move out, or new immigrants to move there instead. But we think probably it's sufficient enough to just advertise to the point where they have rational incentives thereby to move there. A bit of frameworking before we begin with the main part of the case. So as I said, to some extent, a lot of the main questions you would ask when seeing this motion are answered effectively by the fact that the status quo. So in other words, why Ottakring? Because there's already a lot of immigration that's happened there. So to a large extent, there's a question of, at the point where we have this large ethnic minority population, how we best manage that in terms of our obligation to provide them with state service in the first instance, and second, our wider obligation in terms of social stability to integrate them into the general population. But second, though, we would point out the point where Croatia has now joined the EU and thereby is going to soon join Schengen, and the point where Serbia is foreseeably going to join the EU in the fairly near future and thereby join Schengen as well, we're going to see a larger influx of people who speak Serbo-Croat into Vienna and into Austria. And the question is then how we manage that influx. And we think there's a more effective way of dealing with that. We don't think that immigration is necessarily a harm in this debate. We think it's a very positive thing. One, at the point where we have this demographic deficit within Austria and within Western Europe in general, we think that they need these people in order to be able to make that up. In other words, when we're talking about public services, we're talking point where we're thinking about pensions as well. We need an influx of younger people in order to be able to afford what are in some ways overfunded services under the status quo. We say second, though, that one, the kind of people that immigrate, this is the basis upon which America was founded, the kind of people that do immigrate tend to be those from the more entrepreneurial parts of these countries. So many of those people are the people with new ideas and new people able to kind of dynamically contribute to our economy who aren't necessarily able, they think, to be able to get ahead in their home countries. We think those are the kind of people that we want moving to Austria. Don't wave at me, Niels. Third, we think that in terms of the realities of a relationship with Eastern Europe in particular, one of the reasons they've chosen Austria to move to is because Austria has historically had very good ties with Eastern Europe. After the fall of the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War, it was Austrian banks and Austrian road manufacturers who were the first to move into Eastern Europe. That's why it's Austria that many of these people are located to. And the point where, as with increased European integration, these places become booming markets. By having more people from those areas move into our country, obviously when they retain certain ties with their home countries, that means, again, Austria has a starting advantage over other European countries that they choose Austria to relocate to. At the point where the policy makes that integration more easier for them, we think thereby they have an incentive to do it, and we gain from them choosing to do so. So first, why is state provision of services much better? So one, we point out, to some extent, this is self-provided for by these communities. So in other words, there are certain institutions they themselves set up in the form of Orthodox churches, or in the case of mosques, if we're talking about Muslim Bosnians. But we say that in and of itself is one of the harms that happens under the status quo, because if you have a large number of mosques throughout Austria, that's the kind of thing that incurs hostility from conservative Christians. That's what the kind of thing that the FPÖ can rely upon to try and gain votes in elections. We say that it's much better if you have those isolated to particular communities whereby the people who are living in those communities are better able to access those services. But it also happens in perhaps less obvious ways in terms of the provision of state services like healthcare and like, say, legal provision. At the point where there are linguistic barriers to entry, it is easier to provide people with access, people with training to be able to speak those languages in the healthcare service if the people who are accessing those services are located in a particular geographic area. Also, more importantly, the police. It is unreasonable to demand that every single policeman within Austria speaks Serbo-Croat. However, it's entirely reasonable to demand that every policeman who is operating in Ottakring speaks Serbo-Croat. And that creates a relationship of trust between these communities and the police that both means they're better able to access police services, but also they're more likely to themselves volunteer information to the police, which helps fight crime in these areas. Third, we say in terms of being able to provide these people with the language skills they need to integrate within Austrian culture more generally, we say that language provision, just for reasons of economy of scales, is better able to be provided for if people who are the potential clients of this language teaching are located in a particular area. Finally, we say, this is not really ghettoization. Ghettoization is something that happens when you don't have active state support of these services. We say instead, this gives us an opportunity to set up clear partnerships with community leaders in these areas. This also gives the ability, I'll speak about that in a moment, I'll take closing.
What incentives do you believe that the state has to cater to these immigrants?
Well, one, as I said, we've got incentives in terms of one, wanting an immigrant population, and second, wanting them wanting to meet our obligations to these people in terms of state service provision, and third, in terms of wanting to avoid the social harms caused by non-well integrated immigrant communities. I think these are all obvious points. But note, though, that under the status quo, when you have a large number of isolated immigrants, in terms of their ability to access politics, they tend to vote for minority interest parties. However, in our status quo, where you have them isolated into one particular area as a mass voting bloc, they're more likely to be ethnic minority representatives of already mainstream parties. So in other words, those parties have an incentive to move into that area and have effectively Serbo-Croat candidates. We say this is more likely to have, one, their issues actually access mainstream politics to the point where they're going to, the federal conferences for these parties and putting their platform forward and say, this is the thing that is going to when you vote in Ottakring. But second, it just means they're less likely to be marginalized in terms of the political discourse they're engaging in. Finally, why do we think this will benefit integration? Obviously, intuitively, some ways having a distributed population means you make more friends, but we think in terms of the psychology of the people who are operating with these things, it's actually much better if they're in isolated areas. Why is this? Well, we think that one of the problems that immigrant communities face is they feel that they might be losing their home culture. We say that that's the reason why they tend to force more cultural conservative values on their children, because they fear that loss that would happen if they were to mainstream them. Second, it lessens hostility from the domestic populations. Why is this? One, they're no longer competing directly for housing. That's one of the main sources of hostility under the status quo. You're less likely to see these groups as homogenous at the point where there's a large diversification within these areas. It's less easy to see that. At the point where we're reducing the harms caused by shutting people out due to linguistic barriers, that means we also reduce the hostility towards immigrant communities because of association with things like crime. Finally, Chinatown acts as a very good model of ways in which it's much better to allow people to opt into cultural diversity by, say, going to Chinese restaurants within Chinatown and experience that in a condition of safety rather than having it forced upon them. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for his final remarks and to open the case for the opposition. It is my great pleasure to call upon the leader of opposition here.
When a government makes a policy, a government sends a message. And when that policy is these people ought live over there, away from the rest of us, you send a message that those people are different. You send a message that those people do not have the ability to be part of a broader society, to be part of Viennese society. And when you send that message, you create cultural enclaves that say, Eastern Europeans ought live here, not with us, not with real people, so to speak. When you create cultural enclaves, you weaken those you would like to help, specifically immigrants. I'm going to get to fleshing that out, though, after I deal with some rebuttal of what we just heard. So the first 3.5 minutes of his speech was largely non-contentious and pretty much a repetition of the context slide, that this is happening in the status quo, this is something that's happening in Ottakring. Yes, that's what the context slide is for. And then he spends 2 minutes talking about how immigration is good, immigrants and entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs. Yes, we also agree with that. This is not contentious, this is not part of the debate. The debate is whether or not the creation of cultural enclaves for these people is something that helps them or harms them, something they didn't really engage in except for in the past 3.5 minutes of their speech, which is something I'm about to rebut. So first, the main point they flesh out in their speech is that it's easier to render these services to those people, and he fleshes out really 2 main reasons. 1, there's less cultural backlash, and 2, it would be easier to provide for infrastructure. And the example he really uses to illustrate this is linguistics. So first, when it comes to backlash, you might marginally get slightly less backlash in the short term by doing this. But we think you only do so by prolonging what backlash exists, by separating them from each other and preventing the cultural exchange that is required in the short term from taking place. That short-term cultural exchange is what creates long-term cultural acceptance. And even though you might marginally mitigate like short-term harms of Viennese people like, oh, there's so many mosques being built, we think that we would still be able to mitigate this in the long run by encouraging people from connecting. You get weaker interaction by providing people literal incentives to live in a certain place. There's no contact between people. And why this is important is often people's perceptions of other groups, of groups who are not them, are largely formed by stereotype. Stereotype given to them by the media, or given to them by prominent individuals in society, or given to them by only meeting someone or one person of this ethnic group, which we think is mitigated when you have the ability to interact with more of these people. Like when you meet an Eastern European who does not fit the stereotype you've been given about what Eastern Europeans are like and how Eastern Europeans act, either your stereotype has to expand to include Eastern Europeans who are not part of the mold you see all Eastern Europeans fitting, or your stereotype has to break entirely. The way you view them has to break because you recognize that there are people who dramatically do not fit the way you see that group. We think this is what you get in our side of the house when you do not provide people incentives to separate. Okay. Secondly, he talks about linguistic services and how this is easier to provide for services. But we think that there's more going on in a government allocation of funds than simply the literal aggregation of people in one place. We think that for two reasons we actually get this better on our side of the house. First, we want to provide checks on the ability of an individual who wants to disadvantage a certain group from doing so. We would ask the government side to give us a reason why we should let a potential or a hypothetical Viennese politician who would like to disadvantage the Eastern Europeans from saying, they all live here, it's really convenient for me to allocate less funding to that area, to allocate less funding to those people, and disadvantage them further. We want them to give us a reason why we should make that process easier, rather than providing a check against it on our side of the house by allowing them to diffuse into broader society. But secondly, we question that simply concentrating these people even gets this. We think that these people will be less able to lobby their government if they're demarcated in this way. We think that there already are cultural barriers preventing these people from immediately integrating into larger Viennese society. This is true, we grant that. But we think that when we keep that in mind, and also remember unique economic disadvantages that almost uniquely hurt immigrants, we think that it becomes difficult for these groups to petition local governments because maybe they cannot vote. They don't have access to large amounts of funds. They don't have many connections outside their cultural enclaves that can petition the government from multiple angles. No, thank you. So when we're looking for these groups trying to provide these services for themselves, we see they're less able to lobby when they're being separated from society through government incentives. Okay. Why is the physical discrimination of people more harmful when the government starts incentivizing the behavior? First off, and I talked about this a bit already in my rebuttal, cultural. We think it's difficult to break down stereotypes when people don't interact. This is already true. But when it becomes through government incentives, we think it becomes worse. When the government, as he stated in his model, is going to actually financially incentivize people to live here, or people to move out of here because they do not fit the Eastern European stereotype, is when you get the government backing up the lack of interaction between two groups, when the government itself is being the one facilitating the lack of interaction. This is difficult, and I want to explain the example of things like the gay rights movement. In places like Russia, where the difficulty in interaction between the LGBTQA community and the rest of society is something the government backs up, it means people now have to almost go against the government to get this interaction. Or people in the community feel that the government does not support them. There's no reason for them to come out in the open because the established power structures do not cater to them, do not care for them, do not want them in society. This is difficult because it prevents the interaction that we would like from taking place, because that's the mechanism by which cultural change is happening. Back half.
Could you name 3 dishes of Ukrainian food?
No, because I am American and there is no interaction between Ukrainian culture and US culture. If there were more interaction, I would be able to do this. That's why on our side of the house, we would like to create more interaction by not giving Eastern Europeans demarcated places where they ought live, because that is what the government's incentivizing. Okay, secondly, political change. We think that people in segregated areas are often unable to see the interactive benefits on the political level. This is because individuals who live in enclaves often are less connected to individuals outside of the enclave, because they're brought in and they don't have an incentive to leave that neighborhood because everyone there speaks their language, and why would they go elsewhere? Secondly, they have less experience interacting with support structures that function outside of their areas of influence. Things like companies or government institutions that might not operate with their cultural language or with their cultural values, so they feel like they can't interact with it. Or they have to face discrimination based on language, culture, or stereotype to even interact outside of their community, which would preclude the existence of other support systems if they feel like they would face discrimination by leaving. When this is coupled with the economic disadvantage seen uniquely among immigrants, things like having economic problems that cause people to want to immigrate in the first place, or being unable to get opportunity economically because they feel isolated, you see unique harms. Because they feel culturally and economically disadvantaged, they can't access their government's mechanisms of change. They can't petition, they can't lobby, because they feel like both on the cultural level and the legislative level that the government isn't catering to them, that cultures do not accept them, and they are unable to interact with that. When we have these unique things tied together, when people are unable to make cultural change, unable to make political change, because they're being set up into these enclaves by government incentives, that's when you get harms, that's when you should vote opposition. Thank you.
I thank the previous speaker for his final remarks, and to continue the proposition, the Prime Minister, you're here.
Right, Mr. Speaker. I will talk about two things in my speech. First of all, by providing a cultural safe haven for these immigrants, cultural immigration and social exchange becomes more likely. Secondly, by providing a political safe haven for these immigrants in these areas, political buy-in and political say of these immigrants becomes less likely. So all of my rebuttal will be interwoven, as you can imagine. So first of all, on this idea of providing a cultural safe haven. So the opposition assumed that, we are stereotyping these people by, putting them in this ghetto, and by this we sent the message that we don't want to have anything to do with them, we want to separate them from them, and then we simply don't go into these areas. We gave you multiple examples that this is already not the case. Chinatown is one of the most touristy touristy areas and sites in New York, for example. The Pakistani area in Glasgow, as I've heard, is a very hip place to go. The Jewish area in Paris is a very hip place for young people to go. All that is the case because we believe, and now comes the mechanism, that these immigrants there feel very safe in, the preservation of some parts of their heritage. This to some extent ties into the material Duncan already gave to you, because when we spread those people, just, and atomize and isolate them in a majority society, like individual families being surrounded by very many, non-immigrant people, what happens is the, effect of a Manchester friend of mine, which I don't want to say his name here, but essentially the effect was he was dating a Bosnian girl, but he never met her parents, and she never told him about her parents, essentially because her parents were so sort of concerned about the fact that her child may lose the cultural roots they had when they came over to Manchester, because you have this effect of a very conservative diaspora usually, which feels isolated and feels threatened in their cultural heritage. What we are saying is if we pool them into one ground, we give them a social safe haven and a cultural safe haven where they see that, their surrounding resembles to some extent where they came from, and therefore they're less afraid that their children will completely sort of lose all their cultural ties and therefore lose the ties to their parents in the first place, which is why they are usually so reluctant to give them freedom and to boss them or not to boss them around. In the moment that they lose this fear, we think that these kids will have much more freedom to interact. And I think this is sort of what we tie into the metric of opening opposition. They want more exchange, they want more interaction, but we only can get more interaction, particularly among the young people, and I think they are the social capital Duncan was talking about, which are the people who in the long term, you know, are the ones who are replacing the youth we don't have in Western Europe, right? When the young people are allowed by their parents to integrate. And we think only these places of a cultural safe haven where they are together are the prerequisite for these kids to get this freedom by their parents. I'm willing to take closing, if you like, yeah?
Don't you think that this cultural hysteria, like you talked about, happens not because of being threatened, but because of a resentment in the minority group towards the majority group?
But this resentment happens particularly when you feel threatened here, and it also happens if you're politically marginalized in the political context, and this quite nicely leads me to my second point, because essentially, particularly closing up seems to say, oh, you know, we have no incentive whatsoever as a government if we simply shut them away in this dirty area there. So we have two responses to that. Number one, we are the government to some extent here, right? In this. So, I mean, do it the smart way. Do all the things we proposed, like providing services. But even if you don't think that this is enough, we think it's better if we put them together for their political influence and for them to get a say in this country. Why is that? Because of the following mechanism. Usually, even if you're not a citizen of the state, within European law, I think, you have a certain right to vote on a local government. Not on the national level usually, but quite often most states give non-citizens the right, if they're inhabitants, if they're residents of a certain area, to vote on the local government. If you atomize these people, the problem is that they will never have people they can vote as their representatives of the minority community there, because they're just not enough there's not enough of a critical mass in these in this residential areas they're living in. If we put them together, actually they can set up their representatives. And it's likely that there will be a democratically legitimized representative by the minority group in the local government. Two things. Why is that great? Number one, because then they don't have to petition the local government, as opening opposition say. They will simply be the local government, Mr. Speaker. Right? They have much more political say if they have their representatives in sort of making political actions. But what's maybe even more important, when you have a democratically legitimized representative, you have a partner you can talk with. Right? This is a massive problem in all immigration politics, that usually, you know, migrant communities are very sort of fractured political communities. You don't have really a person you can talk to, you don't have really a person you can make binding agreements about. We think it becomes, for example, much more likely that those areas will effectively self-police themselves if we have a person we can talk to who has some power in his local area, where we can make power deals with, and it becomes much more likely that this person will be there if he's elected democratically. And this will only happen under our mechanism, that he has the authority actually to say, oh, I negotiated this deal, you know, for example, we will have more migrant policemen, and therefore we will sort of engage with policemen more often, and allow them into our houses, or share intelligence or something like that. So we think, for the reason of social safe havens and political safe havens, this is a great idea. Vote pro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We think that when opening government gets up here and tells you they want to make safe havens, both politically and culturally, for these immigrants. They're not realizing the kind of situations these immigrants are put in when they come to these countries. They're not realizing the kind of discrimination, systematic and cultural, that is currently inhibiting the mobility of these people, and they only exacerbate it when they put them within these areas, when they distract from other problems that are more serious and need to be addressed in ways that don't entrench these people in one area, that don't entrench them in enclaves where they're less likely to be given political and social resources in the future. What I'm going to bring you today in my extension is expanding on Jacob's point, talking about how change needs to be organic, and when we isolate these immigrant communities in Ottakring, there's going to be less change and less acceptance, both culturally and politically. This is going to directly clash with the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, but also with what we think is going to come out of government bench as a whole. Firstly, I have 3 direct points of rebuttal. So from the first people who hear this idea coming out again, like the government should be providing services particularly to this area, and like public services are good for this area. 2 responses to this. We say, firstly, Jacob and I are fine with expanding public services in general, and we're also fine with making sure there's less discrimination and less like racism within services that are offered currently. I think we would like be happy to reform all political services offered to people and all kind of police services so people feel more safe coming to these people. We think a lot of like systematic discrimination is involved because there were like lots of reliance on cultural stereotypes against these former Yugoslavic regions. We think a lot of this is left over from former like histories of these places and the way they interacted. We'd be fine instituting reforms in these places to make things more comfortable. We don't think we need to do it within this area. So second response is that we think when we preference this one area, we think these services now distract from other problems that are more systematic. When the government can point to this and be like, look, we are giving more services to this area. This is why there can't be any more problems. We think it distracts in the way that immigrants are still less likely to be able to get jobs because they are less connected, because there still is discrimination within greater society as a whole. So I think when we do offer these services, it distracts from future progress we can make in this area. I think it distracts from the government being held accountable for future progress because they can point at the service they're offering and say, look, we've already solved the problem. I think this is really negative. Okay, second point of rebuttal. They tell us that they're providing cultural safe haven. I think it's kind of funny they bring up the idea of Chinatown in New York City and then tell us it's a tourist place where people feel safe. Okay, we have 2 problems with this. Firstly, we think this essentializes their culture. We tell you these cultural enclaves often rely upon stereotypes because these people are often forced to rely on making their own businesses and on making their own like cultural experience. So I think when people go to like my relatives' restaurants in Chinatown to get authentic Chinese culture and authentic Chinese food, it essentializes what it means to be Chinese. We think in the same way, these kind of gated communities, these kind of isolated communities are going to have to rely upon their cultural stereotypes. They're going to have to become the touristy Chinatown that like opening government for some reason seems to like. So it's a problem because they essentialize the way that these cultures are viewed. And this leads to less understanding of these cultures. I think this is a big problem we're going to see in these communities when you only have one culture that this government is now supporting as isolated. Second problem with this is we tell you this is going to lead to less interaction. Tell you like this idea of having a safe haven doesn't actually ring true because what we see happening is this safe haven is going to lead to more cultural discrimination from outside this minority group. We see when a majority can look at this minority group and say, look what's happening. They're just expressing their own culture in this one area, but they're not interacting with us. We see people are going to be less likely to leave this safe haven, so they're going to face more discrimination in the future and from other areas that aren't going to be addressed because of the problems we've already talked about. No, thank you. So this safe haven isn't actually going to be held true because they're still going to face discrimination when they try to leave that society. They're still going to face pressure from within the community. I'm going to explain this a little bit later on. Third and last point of rebuttal, this idea about political safe haven. They tell us there's going to be more political say if they're represented within like local governments. They're going to be able to advocate for themselves better. Why isn't this true? Why won't they get representation? First reason, economically. We tell you these immigrant groups who just moved in, we think they're less likely to have connections. Jacob already told you about this in his speech. And they're less likely to have the kind of connections that are essential to getting jobs when you move to a new area. And there's also kind of like, they already told us there's a linguistic barrier. We think this also provides like hard problems for people when they're trying to get jobs within an area that often discriminates upon local dialects, often discriminates on country lines and country ethnicities. So I think economically these people aren't going to be able to advocate for themselves because in general immigrant groups are more economically disenfranchised for certain like societal reasons, but for certain economic reasons as well. They're less likely to be able to advocate for themselves because they're less likely to have more money. So political parties won't have any incentive to listen to them, especially when they're all in one area. We think it's easier to discriminate against one area. But why is the second reason they're not going to get representation? We think there's social discrimination. We think political parties are more likely to be able to discriminate against one group or one ethnic group, especially if they're in one region. I think it's more like a political party can actively discriminate against a group when they're in one area, when one ethnicity is in one area. And if that ethnicity isn't the one represented by the political party in power, they're less likely to get representation on a societal level because they're less likely to get understanding because they're not going to leave these enclaves. This leads me directly into my extension. Before I do, one of you.
Okay, interaction happens on both sides. The difference is it takes place with a state of psychological security on our side. Whereas on your side of atomization, I'm less likely to report crime because the police can't speak Serbia. I'm more likely to turn to crime because I can't get a job.
Okay, thank you. We don't think that immigrants are more likely to be criminals. We think this is a kind of a stereotype that's also in society. But why do we think they're not going to go to police? And why do we think they're not going to actually have this kind of psychological safe haven? Okay, we think they're not likely to go to police on your side of the house because they don't fix for the kind of racial discrimination that's happening within police services. We think just offering them in this one area police who speak their language isn't going to solve for the fact that if they want to leave this area, they won't be able to access those resources anymore. We think we want these immigrants to be able to feel safe within greater society, not just within Ottakring, within Vienna. We think it's important for these immigrants to be able to feel like they can leave this area and still be able to interact with the police. We think we need to fix this on a larger level. Why don't they feel psychologically safe? We think that when they're forced to psychologically only feel safe in one area, it doesn't allow for them to interact with greater society in general. We think that leads to them not being able to express their culture effectively within greater Vienna, greater Austria as a whole. We think this detracts from the amount they're able to share of their culture. Okay, my extension. So why does this isolation of immigrant communities in Ottakring lead to less change and less acceptance? Two reasons. Firstly, we think change needs to be organic. No, thank you. We see that Jacob already told you that stereotypes come from a lack of interaction. But why will this lack of interaction actually happen? Jacob explained these to you already, but I'm going to take this a little further by adding, we think these immigrants are less likely to leave their enclaves. Why is this true? I think when you have one area that's specifically identified by an ethnicity or by a race, we think that people are more likely to be forced to stay in these areas. We think that, like, currently in places like Chinatown, people are forced within that community to not leave that community because the identity is the thing that's holding that community together and making them a stronger power. I think that people are forced to not leave this community. I think it detracts from their ability to not only interact with greater society and the government as a whole, but also to express their community outside. For this reason, I think people on these enclaves aren't going to leave the enclaves, aren't going to leave these isolated communities, so they won't be able to interact with people. I think this leads to greater stereotypes, not only within the majority looking at this identity group, but also within these communities. I think these communities are likely to feel oppressed because people won't understand and won't be able to change their stereotypes about them. I think this lack of interaction is especially negative and more likely to happen on our side. But secondly, why do you think this is going to lead to more political resentment, more political oppression? We think they're less likely to be able to represent themselves, less likely to get representation. I think this is going to widen the divide between these immigrant communities and larger society as a whole. And we need to be breaking down these barriers, need to be changing stereotypes, need to be getting more political representation within these isolated communities. I tell you, these isolated communities only entrench current problems and don't address them, don't help the immigrant communities at all. For these reasons, please oppose. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and indeed the entirety of the first half of the opening house. And to open up the second half of this debate in the case for the closing propositions, it's my great pleasure to call upon the member of government here.
Okay. We believe that this is a great idea, and we believe that all the problems that we've heard from the other side about their ability to get ahead in life, to get into societies, to get better jobs, to get better representation, all rely on one very important thing, is that is the openness of the society, of the majority, to accept these people and to embrace these people. And we believe that embracing their culture is the key to that. I will talk about three things. I will talk about what we have to gain from having this area. I will talk about why for women and children, for the weak societies, this is very important. And I will talk about why it frees a person from fighting for his identity, which is a key thing in order to really embrace yourself in different things. Now, I want to talk a few points of the rebuttal. So the government is saying when you do a policy, you send a message. We're saying that's right. And the message you are sending here that we have a culture here that is worth embracing. We have a culture here that we want to see. The restaurants, the smells, the music, all of those things are something that are worthwhile. They are something that have value, and we want to see it and we want to cherish it. The second is you said they are claiming that the key is for them to become more of our culture, and we're saying this is not the message that we want. We want a society that we can have many different cultures, many different things, and all of them have place, and all of them should be celebrated, and you do not have to change and to adjust yourself to your culture. Your culture is wonderful, and we do not accept that a culture is a stereotype. A culture is a beautiful thing that should be celebrated. No. Now, you said something about their powers being elected. Already today, as first government told you, they are usually living in the same areas, so it's not that much of a difference anyway. And we think it's more important that all the things that I would show you. And you're talking about the fact that now you're giving this, then they can't say they have a problem and get more things. We don't understand why. Still, you can come and object to all of those things. And okay, so now to my point. So as I said, when you have, first of all, why is it something that we have to gain as a country, as a culture? What we have to gain, think about Chinatown. This is another place that you can go to. All the restaurants, because all of you can name 3 different kinds of Chinese food, right? Because you've been there. And for the first time, usually when we see immigrants, we see them when they're weak. They don't speak the language very, very well. They're not really, they're out of place. They don't have the bed. They're always at the weaker place. When we go into Chinatown, for instance, or into their culture, suddenly they explain to us what is this dish. They explain to us their culture. They are the strong ones. We are invited to their culture. And what does that do? That helps us see as a person, not as only always being out of place and always being a misfit and always being a kind of, different. We see them with all the good things in their culture, with all the beautiful things in the culture, and we are now, it's easier for us to accept them, because we think one of the biggest problems we have with strangers in the world are changing people. We have immigrants coming. We are not going to be all the same. People have to come in, and this is wonderful. What we need to do is not to be threatened, because today when we see somebody that is different, we don't, for instance, a child goes to school and he eats food and the food looks funny and it smells weird, and all the kids around him are looking at him as being strange, as weird. But when we know this food, and when we know we've been to that kind of restaurant, it was a great experience with our parents when we went there, now we are value him a lot more. Now it's easier for him also to fit in. He doesn't have to have a sandwich with everything else. He can come with his authentic food, and he's not judged by it. And this is not a small thing. This is not about what you have as a snack. It's about the fact that your culture is not something that scares and other people reject it. It's the fact that other people are now attracted to it and see it as a good thing, and we think this is very, very important. Now, yes?
Also, the House has been clear in saying we like cultural interaction.
Yes, but you don't. Oh, sorry.
But when the interaction is on an individual basis and not the cultural essentialism that drives tourism, we think that.
But we think there's nothing wrong with it, because when a person needs to fight by himself, I'm a Jewish and I'm from Israel, and when I'm in Israel, I don't feel that I have to defend who I am. So I'm not religious, and I don't care about being Jewish, and I don't care about all those things, because I have a place that gives me all of that, and when I want to feel connected and want to feel all the things, it's great. That's my third point. I'm going to get there just in a second. So we see them for once not weak as an individual, strong as a society that they're proud of and that we want to go into. Now, in many cases, I want to talk now about women and children. These cultures come from a patriarchal culture. They come from a place when the man is the strongest, is the most respected, is the dominant, and then they come into a different state. And what happens there usually is that the men find it harder to adjust, because suddenly they need to go downrank with the jobs that they have and the respect, and suddenly their children speak better English or the language that they do. The women usually can let go of their ego many times easier, so they can get more jobs easier, and the man is left behind. And what happens there? The man itself feels very, very frustrated and very, very sad, because every day he walks around everywhere, seeing people, every look he gets, seeing him as being less, seeing him as being a misfit, no respect, and respect is very important there. And he never has that release, that place when he has the same culture that before, when he can get that respect. And what does that man do usually? He limits his children, he limits his wife, he keeps them down. If we can give that man a place, if we can give in those societies that do come from patriarchal place, a place where he is proud of himself, where he is strong, where his culture, by the way that people even address him, the small thing of the words, you talk to a man differently, and he's used to that, okay? So for the next generation, the way he will raise his children, today when he feels that he has this respect and doesn't have to fight by it and compete with his children, it will help also the children in the next generation when they go outside and when they go to the different places. And this is a very, very important thing if we look at the next generation, their ability to be there. Okay, now I want to talk about how it frees you from fighting for your identity, because if this is now we're all living together and you do not have your place, I think your time is up. Now it's up. Anyway, Where was I? Identity, fighting for it, something? Yes, okay. So if I need to fight for my identity, if I feel that people are always looking at me in an eye that is different, that they are judging me by the stereotypes which are negative, we're saying maybe they'll be stereotypes, but they will be positive. And this is what we're saying. People know how to differentiate. They know that Chinatown is touristy. They know that not all of the Chinese people just walk around, all the time and eating only this food. They're saying that this is the highlight of our society. We are used to it as people all the time. We know that this is what we see there, and there is no reason not to be proud of those things and not to show those things, the things that they're proud of as something basic in our culture. Now we are less afraid of them. Now we are, as a society, also we have our own, sorry, this is for my first point I got to look for. As a society, we are uncomfortable today with strangers. And this is also our level of happiness, our level of safety, because we feel uncomfortable with somebody that we don't know. It's a stranger. We do not understand where he comes from. When we do understand, we feel safer and we feel better and we're happier in our life because the people around us are not threatening anymore. But I just want to go to the fact, it frees you for the identity, and then you can accept the fact that sometimes I go with the majority and I'm like this, and when I need to feel connected and when I need to feel proud of who I am, of the people that I came from, I can go back to the place where I've been. And from all those reasons, we think this is a fantastic reason, and I think we should definitely do this, and I'd love to try some Ukrainian food. I have no idea what they're serving. Yeah.
Thank the previous speaker for remarks, and to open the case with closing opposition for a great pleasure to call upon the member of opposition here.
Mr. Speaker, we agree that immigration is an active phenomenon and it's here to stay. The question under this motion is, how can we do it better? The government seems to think that we can do it better by creating these enclaves, whereas opposition thinks it's better if we allow immigration the way it usually happens, people to do it individually and to spread out. What I'm going to do, and what I'm going to provide to you as closing government, I'm going to talk to you about, most importantly, how this policy will decrease the quality of life of these immigrants. Both individually and socially. And later I'm going to develop a bit on how this is going to lead to a rise of extremism, both from the immigrants and from the Austrian society. But before that, I have 6 points of rebuttal. So the first one, we hear from the first gov that they get these services. But again, as I raised in my POI, we don't see why they would get these services. We know that politics are distributional. Politicians have limited resources and they get to decide where to allocate them. Now, we see that that immigrants can be of either two kinds. Either they can vote or they can't vote because they don't have citizenship. If they don't have votes, they will be abandoned. If they do have votes, still we believe that the cultural ties we believe that the cultural ties of Austrians, of the Austrian police, of the Austrian politicians will give them less of an incentive to do this, and I'll develop this. Second of all, we hear that it's going to be easier to integrate them because you can target them. But yes, in the same way, they can also be targeted by extreme groups. The way, say in Hungary, Roma communities, because they're so segregated in an enclave, they can be more easily targeted by extremists the way they have, and they have been attacked for this. Fourth point, they developed this thing of cultural safe havens. We've already heard quite a lot of rebuttal on that, but I'd like to add the fact that actually this is only going to create a cultural safe haven while they're in that haven. Moreover, this is going to lead them less prepared for the outside world. And we see this also from the we see this also from the closing government when they say that you don't have to fight for your identity. Yes, you don't have to fight for your identity when you're in that enclave. When you go outside, what happens is that this enclave leaves you less prepared for the outside world because you have less interaction with it. From the closing government, we also get this that you have gains in culture, but we don't hear how you specifically get those gains from having an enclave. We see that you can have Chinese, Indian, Romanian, whatever restaurants you want, even just by having immigrants. We don't see this as particularly tied to having an enclave. Moreover, we also believe that the damages are quite greater. Last thing we hear from the closing government is that how this disproportionately affects men. First of all, again, we don't see this as specific to this motion. We believe immigrants always have a hard time. What we want to talk about is where do they have an easier time? Do they have an easier time on their side or on our side? And we believe that on their side, these immigrants are going to have a harder time because they have less connections with broader society. They have less social connections. They have less opportunities to find jobs, less opportunities to get education. And so basically, this leads me nicely into my extension where I'm going to tell you exactly how this leads to a decrease of the quality of life of these people. So basically, the general idea is that separation leads to a lower quality of life. Why? The main mechanism is social capital. These people are going to have a decreased social capital, decreased ties with broader society. We see that in a society, you need to have ties with the rest of the people through language, through culture. in order to be able to access the education of that society, in order to be able to access the jobs of that society, even to access the health services. So we know that in most societies that have immigrants, immigrants are on the bottom scale of society. Why is that? Part of it is discrimination, but more importantly, it's the access that these people have through their limited social capital. They don't know broader society. And what we see is that this is going to increase by their proposal. When you put people in an enclave and force them to live there, they have no incentives to connect to broader society. And so we see a couple of ways that this will happen. So you don't have incentives to learn the language, because you have certain social needs that are provided by your local community. So you don't feel the need to learn the language. And we see this is especially happening with enclaves such as Chinatown and so on, when a lot of the immigrants simply don't learn the language, and they can't develop in that society. Moreover, we see that because of this, you have an increased dependence on your own group. You depend on your own group, and therefore you have, again, less of a chance to reach into broader society and to try to integrate, to try to collect, to make the types of connections with broader society that is going to lead us. What we also see is that this is not mutually exclusive with your own identity, and we get the side government emphasize your own identity. You can still keep your own identity and language, but in the same time learn the ways to function in that society, learn the ways to better your life. So this is how we believe this functions on the individual level. But second point, this also functions on the social political level. So again, as I told you, part of the rebuttal, politics is distributional. Politicians get to decide on resources, and we have to see what kind of incentives they have. So turning away from the issue of votes, we see that culture and the way politicians get to empathize with certain groups affect the way they distribute the resources. Moreover, we see that this is particularly important when you have these enclaves where it is particularly easy for them to do this kind of issue. I present the clearest example of this issue is the Harlem community in New York during the 70s and 80s, where these people did not get garbage services, they did not get adequate sanitation. Why? Because of the discrimination of the politicians who were not representing these people, who were not identifying and empathizing with these people. They did not have an incentive to provide these services. We see the exact same, I'll take you in a second, we'll see the exact same thing with Roma communities throughout Eastern Europe, where they're segregated outside of the city and they get no social services, no sanitation, they don't even get adequate police services. Why? Because, again, politicians don't have these incentives to put in these measures. Yes,
okay,
sir.
But that's the kind of organic ghettoization you both said you were fine with. On our side of the house, we give, by voter concentration, an incentive for mainstream political parties to focus on that areas, either by means of coalition formation, rather than the status quo in which you just have minority parties who never actually get into office.
Thank you, sir. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, immigration is always an issue. But the thing is, when you do concentrate them there, it becomes easier for them to be ignored. It becomes easier for them to distribute resources elsewhere, because politicians not only have incentives, but they have pressures. They have pressures to cater to the community of voters and their own identity community. So, quite quickly, how also this is going to lead to a rise of extremism. We see that not only do we see a rise of extremism in general Austrian society, but within these communities themselves. Why? Because they feel that they have been cheated. They feel that this rise of inequality leads to their radicalization, because they feel that, even though they pay taxes, even though they contribute to society, they don't get these services. They still are the bottom half of society. Moreover, we see that if you put them in this enclave, you force them to accentuate their identity. You force them to accentuate themselves as opposed to the outside groups. And we also see that this gives a clearer, easier mechanism for let's say, extreme parties in Austria to again target these groups to make scapegoating easier. So because we see that the quality of the life of these people is going to be downgraded more on their side of the house, we beg you to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for his final remarks. And to close off and summarize the skills and composition of migration letters to call upon the government. You're here.
Okay. Ready? All right.
So we believe this motion will benefit the people of the country and the immigrants. The immigrants will have more place to express their identity. Therefore, they'll have less of a need to actually protect it and actually will integrate into the society better. They will be more open to interaction. The opposition doesn't really know even about Ukrainian food because they probably haven't gone to these places. Like in LA, you have the Ethiopian quarter. You can go there. You can learn about the culture. You can learn about the art. You can learn about the food. You can go to the Armenian quarter and learn about the culture and not actually to be scared of it. Not actually be afraid of it. Break your stigmatism and actually learn more by seeing it, by experiencing it. You say that like if you build like a Chinatown, the Chinese not only integrating in that Chinatown, which is a touristic area, they actually integrate into the society. In Sydney, we see there's a huge integration of Chinese into the country. Not now. They have their own quarter. The whole city is celebrating their festival, and they still are vice presidents, top people in like high-tech companies and everywhere else. Not now. I'll just refer to some of. I'll talk mainly about will this not now. Will this assist? Will this motion actually assist them better to the immigrants and to the society? And will it actually improve or worsen their economic situation and the whole integration from the representation point of view? So just a quick rebuttal. You were saying that they will only stay in their culture, and they will not be able to express it outside. And you were saying. We're saying that connecting and understanding them is the key to integrate them into the society and into the community. Not now. It is harder for someone to fight by himself, but it's easier when you're surrounded by your culture, by your group. You feel like it backs you. You're proud of your culture. You know you can take someone and say, hey, look, this is my friend's restaurant. Come, try some of my food. Try some of the music, the art from where I come from, and actually be proud of it. And this way, you don't need to feel like you have to protect it all the time and have to express your identity all the time. This is the only key to integration, because then the people will feel less threatened by their culture. They will be less hate. They will be less scared of who this person is. So if someone comes with a burqa into work, I've been there. I know what's happened in that quarter, and so I understand where it's coming from. I'm not scared of it. I'm not threatened by it, and so it's easier to understand these people, and this community will create a platform for them to do that. Not now. And when they will integrate, that's what will cause less crime and less fighting, because they will feel like they can integrate into it. They feel like they have their own space where they need it, which is their identity and their culture, and they can embrace it whenever they need, but they don't have to go and show it everywhere and protect it wherever they go. Now, hold on. I'll just go to the first clash. I'll take you later, not now. What will make them part of the community? So the first government talked more about the practice and the benefits, and how the families will be more open and integrated. Then the opposition are talking about that there'll be less culture clash and more stereotype. Maya was explaining you how there'll be more clashes. There'll be less stereotyping, because people actually understand this culture. And then the other opposition was saying that it will only stay in this culture. No, when you have your own space to express yourself, you can go outside and feel confident in yourself and in your identity and integrate into the society. We believe that people will come to this place, will come to this festival, will try the food, will understand the clothes they're wearing and why they're wearing it, and learn more about it and learn about more of this culture. This will make the immigrants more proud of their holidays and their food, and they will not need to protect their identity, and it will benefit because it will actually assimilate them better into the society and the community. It will open up their eyes to of the citizens and the immigrants, and it will make them actually really proud of themselves, and it will give them a place to express themselves where they need it. Now, I'll just quickly go in, yes.
So how do you think it is easier to create connections between the general population and immigrants when they're spread out and you have them all over the country, or when they're concentrated in one place?
We're not saying to concentrate them in one place, but we need to give them that point, this community, this gated place where they have their culture and they have the language where they talk and they have their own festivals celebrated there. They're not necessarily all going to stay just there, but this will give them the safe haven of the cultural of their culture and a place to show other people about their culture, about their language, about their tradition, and that's it. Just about the second clash, about fixing the whole economical problem, no, thank you, and the whole political issues that we have. So we do believe that embracing the culture means that they will be more these people will be more understood, and it will be easier for them to find job and for them to be represented in the government. It will be easier to accept them and understand them, because when you go to these places and you see when you go to these places and integrate into their culture and understand it, and understand how they dress and their art and everything, then someone that comes to you to an interview with a burqa, like I said, you will understand why he's wearing it, and that's why you're not going to be scared of these stigmatizing that there is on the burqa, and you'll understand where it's coming from, and this way you will hire them. And that's how men, as Maya explained, will feel more proud of their culture. They will let their kids open up to this culture, because the immigrants who are the male dominant in those families will not be scared to let the kids actually go out, study in other school, experience the other society, because the immigrants are not going to be scared of it as well, because they're proud of their culture and they know it's actually safe somewhere in this safe haven. So I please call you to go with this motion. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Coalition Whip remarks, and to conclude the case itself, this debate as a whole, I'm very glad to call on the Opposition Whip here.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. We don't believe immigrants are coming to Vienna to rebuild former Yugoslavia here in the neighborhood. We don't believe this is the case, and we believe the government bench, and especially the closing government, fundamentally misunderstand what an immigrant's motivations are and why they choose to leave their country and come to a foreign country. Okay, I have 3 points of clashes, and my rebuttal will be integrated. But the first is, how does this affect the minority and whatever their interest, culture, all this? Then the second is state incentives, what the incentives of the state are, how this whole works in terms of the mechanism. And the third is the consequences and how this affects the majority-minority relations. Okay, so how does this affect the minority culture, the minorities? And this has been the most developed clash throughout this debate. But we do see that this leads to a lower quality of life, and this is basically the big label I want to put on this clash. Because what happens is that you get all these minorities living in one certain enclave, which is basically just like the closing government depicted is a reproduction of what we've seen in their own country. They basically live in these communities, and they are not forced, or they don't have the incentive to move out from them. So basically, they just have their friends in that community, which makes them harder to get a job and to go for individual success. But we do see that the basic incentive for an individual to leave their country is individual success. So they want to be successful in their respective countries. Not preserving culture, it's not, fighting for your own culture. So basically, they confuse here two things. They conflate here two things, national minorities and immigrants. National minorities, yeah, if you think about Catalonia, if you think about Scotland, if you think about all those historical communities, they really want to protect their own culture. But if you, as an immigrant, leave your own country, be it former Yugoslavia, wherever Eastern Europe, you just want to be successful in Vienna or wherever you go to live. And then they talk about these gender relations in the minority group. And basically that this have this weird mechanism that the man will just somehow revenge on their children the fact that their women is working and they don't. But we see this argument assumes that minority cultures are patriarchal, and they never proved that's why former Yugoslav countries' cultures will be more patriarchal than the Viennese Austrian culture. I don't see why this would be the case, and even if certain cases this is the case, they basically ignore the intra-minority dynamic. And this goes throughout their case, that they essentialize culture, and they don't care about those who don't want to be proud of their culture, and they just want to be successful in Vienna, and they want to learn the language, and they don't want to get the services in their own language because they don't believe they left their country to come to Yugoslavia again. And then there's still at this clash. There's still this identity clash, right? So the opening government talks about safe havens, culture, preserving identity, and we talk about individual integration. So where the identity comes into picture. So we believe these things are not mutually exclusive. So you can preserve your own cultural heritage even if you live on an individual basis spread out in your own country. How this happens? Because you still keep your linkages with your former country. You have relatives there. You talk with them. And you travel back home and everything. So we do see this in developed immigrant communities. No, thank you. In throughout Western Europe. Think of just, for example, the Muslim habit to send back your dead relatives to your own country. Okay, so we do see that because the identity is not mutually exclusive, and it does lead to understanding if you have individuals living spread out in the country, because basically they have more interaction with the majority nation. Yeah, and then back to the social capital point again, that this spreading out will just lead to higher social capital and higher odds for integrating in a majority society. Yeah.
But the point is, it's comparative. When you're concentrated, you have more social capital within the political system, and you are less likely to feel your identity is under threat. So when you do interact, you feel less likely to think of yourself as your minority population, more likely to think of yourself as an Austrian. The quality of that interaction is better because you're more psychologically secure.
Thank you. Okay, but we basically don't see that this cultural hysteria that they talk about, that, I'm not gonna present the parents of my of the guy, so basically the daughters are afraid to present their parents to the guy they're dating with. We do see that this is happening because they are provocated by political entrepreneurs, their own representatives. So this is much more likely to happen in their own world, where you have national minority parties and get minorities integrated based on their ethnic identity into politics, because it happens on identity basis, right? It doesn't happen based on interest, on ideology, so on and so forth. So this is much more likely to happen in their world. So what are the state incentives here? This was already read by me. So basically this is like the political clash. But we do see that political representation in their world happens through minority parties. In our world happens based on interest, based on ideology, based on whatever you as an individual want to believe. But we do see that this is the motivation why the individuals want to get integrated in the society, because this is the reason why they left Yugoslavia. Second, we do see that this is what democracy assumes, because if you have representation based on identity, what you will get is no variation between the people. So basically you just will get the same representatives all over and all over again, like it happens in ethnic parties, that they barely change the representation because they don't really have accountability whatsoever. So basically you just get within the minority relations the representatives hijacking the representation from the ones who are supposed to represent. So basically the principal-agent relationship is flipped. No, thanks. And then what the incentives are for the majority nation, or majority politicians to cater to their own, to cater to these societies if they live in an enclave. We don't see any incentives for the majority nation, because what we get is basically living these communities pretty isolated from the majority group. They don't have any interaction, so basically this perceptual distance between the two groups is just increasing. So it becomes much more difficult for a politician to bridge the gap and, to reach across the aisle. So basically we see that they will not cater to this group, they will not share resources, and they're definitely not going to provide the services what opening government talks about. And even if they would provide the services, we don't see that as a minority. You leave your own country to get access to, state bureaucracy on your own language, because you just want to learn the language because you want to become successful. So you have a very different motivations than what they assume you have. Okay, so back to the consequences. So we see that this is the most important clash what this whole debate boils down to. But we do see that in their world, where you have these isolated communities and you have a state which sends the narrative that these people are just different, you have the rise of extremists. And this is particularly relevant in the case of Austria, where you do have a very strong and powerful extreme right party which was in the government, and the EU isolated Austria because of it. And this is the OFP, right? So you do have this historical burden of having extreme right parties scapegoating the minorities. So this happens radicalization because you force back the identity members to their own community. And basically, through this segregation, through this scapegoating, it becomes much more easier and much more rational for the political agents to do this, as opposed to cultural preservation. So basically, what we do see that basically the closing government side essentializes culture, because they only talk about restaurant and food and that patriarchal societies. We do see that this basically ignores the intra-minority relations. And what the opening government talks about, services, safe haven, cultural preservation, but we see that the odds for this to happen are much more likely in the world depicted by the closing government through the higher social capital that the individual has, which also caters into and plugs into the motivation that these immigrants have to become successful in the majority nation, not to rebuild their own country in the neighborhood of Vienna. Thanks.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for contributing to the debate. I'd like to ask all of you guys to please step up outside, shake hands, and